Good evening and welcome again to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes in Leeds and Manchester. Today we have the pleasure to receive Dr. Andrew Fear, who will participate in our 5th edition of the program Hispanglia, which seeks to vindicate the contribution of the different personalities, in this case civilizations like the Romans, and figures throughout the history which contributed to the dialogue and the common shared history of Britain and Spain. As I said, today we will have the pleasure to hear Dr. Fear speaking about the Roman civilization. The Roman civilization, as you might know, of course, is one of the most advanced in history in all aspects, led through a very rich legacy. In law, for example, the Romans brought us most of the civil law not only in the continent, but in Britain, in most of the Western world, is a heritage from the Roman time. In architecture, the infrastructure they built up in whole Europe is after more than 2,000 years still being used in some of the places. And also in the language, the Romans, they brought the Latin, and through the Latin, not only the Roman languages like French, Spanish, or Italian, but also in English or even German have lots of words from Latin. So the heritage and the richness of the Roman empire and political system is really huge. And we are very happy that with Dr. Fear, we will see tonight how Spain and Britain interacted in the Roman Empire times. And it is also an aspect of our common history that not very well known and not very well analyzed also. So through this analysis from Dr. Fear, we will see how Spanish-born emperors like Hadrian or Magnus Maximus, they came to Britain, they brought many things, but also not so well known or not so important people who were between those realities. The Iberian Peninsula and Britannia established a dialogue that lasted until today. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much, Dr. Fear, Andrew Fear, for having accepted our invitation. And without further ado, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Debo agradecer a ustedes por invitarme esta noche. Y bueno, ahora voy a hablar en inglés porque se nota mi acento es un poco feo, ¿eh? Entonces, voy a compartir.
Oh, the accent is perfect. You speak very good Spanish. Better than I do speak English.
So now I hope people can see a screen which says Iberia in Britannia.
Yes, we can see that perfectly, yes.
So what you see on the screen is, I beg your pardon, my version of the Pan-Hispanic flag, and I've changed it a little bit. So on either side, we see a Roman coin. On the left-hand side, there is Britannia. She's looking a little bit sad, sitting on a rock with holding her head in her hands. It's a base metal coin. And on the right-hand side, we can see Hispania lying in the sun. And interestingly, I think everybody can see the little conejo by her feet. And that sort of picks up an idea that some people say that the name of Spain actually comes from a Semitic word for the rabbit. But there is the rabbit. The interesting thing about these coins, I think, is that they show the relative wealth of these two provinces of the Roman Empire. So Britain, a much poorer country than Spain in the Roman period. But also, they were both struck by a man who we'll see is a very famous Hispano-Roman, the Emperor Hadrian himself. And although this isn't quite the first image of Britannia that we have from the Roman period, it is the first image of her with a spear and a shield, that very typical image that we had on our coins for very, very many years. In fact, they started with Charles II until, unfortunately, her image was removed some years ago and we now have those very dreadful childish backs on our coins. But my starting point, therefore, is to argue, is in fact Britannia. Here she is. This, in fact, is the lady who Charles II wanted to be his girlfriend, a lady called Frances Stuart. Not a bad chat-up line, I suppose, putting your potential girlfriend on the coins. But is Britannia, that very, very British, iconic figure, really in some ways a legacy of Roman Spain? Now, when we look at the relationship between our two countries, it's quite interesting that the Roman historian Tacitus actually, as he goes through his description of Britain, marks out one part as potentially Spanish. So that's the south of Wales, inhabited by the tribe called the Silures. I've drawn a little red line on the map round there for you. And you can see, according to Tacitus, the Silures' complexion, their curly hair, and their location opposite Spain, perhaps geography wasn't the strongest point in Tacitus's intellectual armory, make one believe that the ancient Iberians had crossed over and occupied this region. And curiously, if you go to that region to this day, if you go to the town of Newport, you can see the Newport ship, this medieval ship that was rescued by the townspeople there when it was found in the River Usk. And that ship, when analysis was done, in fact, has timber from the Basque country. I was talking about the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian, most of our sources would say, was born in the town of Italica, which is the modern pueblo of Sante Ponce, very close to Sevilla in the south of Spain. It's a very old Roman town. In fact, it was founded by Scipio Africanus for Roman veterans in the middle of the Second Punic War, when the Romans were fighting against Hannibal. Hadrian's dad was also called Hadrian. I've put his name on the screen for you there, Publius Aelius Adrianus Afer. And his mother, so on both sides, he was a Spaniard. A lady called Domitia Paulina came from Cadiz, or ancient Gades, just down the road. Hadrian became emperor in 117 AD, and of course, famously, was a great traveller. So he began a world tour of his possessions in AD 121. The following year, he came to Britain, but we know for a fact he was back in Tarragona in Catalonia by the end of that year. So perhaps Britain wasn't such an exciting place for him. Here's Hadrian. There's his mum and dad, both from Andalusia. When he becomes emperor, he starts his world tour and he goes to Britain. Although, as we can see there, he comes back to Tarragona, Roman Tarraco, quite soon afterwards. So I've just put there the little arrow showing you where Hadrian was born, Italico, his father was from, and the lower arrow, of course, shows you Cadiz, ancient Gades down there, almost on the Straits of Gibraltar. This is in Sante Ponce. I'll do my little bit for the Andalusian Tourist Board. This is the Roman theatre, and it's nice to think that perhaps the Emperor Hadrian sat on one of these seats watching the plays. The theatre, in fact, was built by an ancestor of another famous emperor, Trajan, who was also born here, and there's a little inscription running across the front there telling you that this man called Trius actually helped build this structure. Hadrian fancied himself as a poet, and he had a little exchange with a man called Florus, who again is probably in fact from Roman Spain. And you can see these little poems. So Florus writes to his emperor, "I don't want to be a Caesar, strolling amongst the Britons, lurking around something or other." Sadly, that part of our text is lost. "Suffering Scythian winters." And of course, Scythia is the far north of Europe. So Florus here typically complaining about the British weather. Hadrian wrote back saying, "I don't want to be a Florus, strolling about the bars, lurking around fast food shops and suffering bloated fleas." So this was meant to be, I think, a jocular exchange between the two, but we can see the British weather features already. Now, Britain was in a bad way when Hadrian came. My quotation is from a Roman text that the Britons could not be kept under Roman rule, is what it says. The previous emperor Trajan had taken troops away from Britain to fight wars elsewhere. And actually, in this period, it's where the mystery of the Ninth Legion, which is part of our story in many ways, also lurks. Hadrian came with a new governor for this province, the man here called Notorious, and a new legion, number 6 Victrix, to replace number 9. And of course, and this, I think, arguably is Roman Spain's biggest legacy to Roman Britain. It's the Spaniard, the Emperor Hadrian, who orders this magnificent structure to be built across Britain. Here we can see the wall and also one of the small garrison posts, a mile castle embedded into it. And I think it is fair to say that the building of this wall defines the province of Britannia. So it's a very, very important structure indeed that's put down at this point. That's not to say it isn't a very mysterious structure. So people are arguing to this day what exactly Hadrian's Wall was for. And here's a little part of a little children's poem. The Scotsmen and the Romans did not get on at all. To stop the Scots from stealing sheep, the Romans built a wall. And actually, I think there's probably quite a lot in that. This is less to do with building a big wall to stop a massive invasion, a la Game of Thrones, for example, and more probably to stop raiding and low-level attacks. How good it was at that is a very interesting question. One thing that's true about it is the planning of it is very rigid. When we look at where those little forts are put and such like, they don't really fit with the topography. And as soon as the emperor goes, really very important modifications were made to the wall. And the governor, for example, Hadrian brings with him, falls from grace. And maybe that's because the emperor had heard that he'd fiddled with the wall. So how good it was is an interesting question. Hadrian seems to be quite good at big pictures, so to speak, but maybe not so good at the details. And if we look at his hometown, we can perhaps see that. So here's a view, an aerial view of the Roman part of Italica. You can see the massive amphitheatre, the 5th largest in the Roman world. They're well worth going to visit. Behind it, where you see the cypress trees, is the Roman suburb that Hadrian built. And on the crest there, where the last trees are, there was an enormous temple he built to his predecessor, Trajan, which is now the Pueblo Cemetery. The Pueblo, you can see there, that arch of white houses in the middle distance, and Sevilla, in fact, is top left on that photograph. But our interest is bottom right, and there I think you can see my blue arrow points to a little pantano, and in front of it, the 2 red arrows to either end of a dam, a presa, and that was built by the waterboard in Spain, 1970. Before that, unfortunately, the amphitheatre is a natural line of drainage, and it used to flood on a regular basis. And all the lovely houses amongst those cypress trees were built on clay foundations and started to subside. So again, you can see the big picture is there, but maybe the details and the thinking aren't quite there with Hadrian. Poor Hadrian. He gives Britain this magnificent structure, but actually very soon he loses credit for it. So late Roman historians, writing in the 4th century AD and beyond, start to attribute Hadrian's Wall to a later emperor, Septimius Severus. And I've given some lists of people who do that there, including a man I'm particularly interested in, Orosius, who was a Spaniard himself, but wants to give the wall to Septimius Severus. Because of that, I've listed them here for you on the screen, a lot of British medieval historians also started to do precisely that. So although Hadrian, you might have thought, would have left a fantastic legacy in Britain, it's lost because of this mistake. The man who saves Hadrian's reputation and brings it back today, I suppose the reason we call Hadrian's Wall today, is this gentleman on the screen, a vicar from the northeast of England, the Reverend John Hodgson, also actually who helped develop mining safety in Britain. But he's the man who definitively showed that Hadrian's Wall was indeed Hadrian's Wall, and therefore is, if you like, responsible for the resurrection of his reputation. Now, connected perhaps with Hadrian is the mystery of the 9th Legion. And many of you will know the title of the 9th Legion was Hispana. So why was it called Hispana? It came to Britain as part of the original invasion force in AD 43, although frankly it has a really rough time in Britain. It gets knocked around by quite a lot of people. It's then last attested in York, so not a million miles from Leeds, for those who are on that side of the Instituto. And here I've put the fragmentary inscription that you can see in York to this day. We've been on the Legionary fortress there. And if you look very carefully at the bottom right there, you can see the beginning of Hispana, just the H and the I are left. I've underlined them in red for you. We know that that inscription dates from the year 108, 109 AD. And we have no more formal attestation of this legion. For many years, of course, people thought it was destroyed in Scotland. Many people would have read Rosemary Sutcliffe's novel for children, The Eagle of the Ninth, which is a tremendous read. But actually, I think it's fair to say that pottery and small finds show that this legion was moved to Holland in the 130s, and it was probably destroyed, in fact, on the eastern frontier, not in England at all. But why Hispana? Well, as you can see, the badge is entirely appropriate. There is this toro, which is the Legionary Badge. It's a battle on. The 9th Legion fought in Cantabria, Asturias, and as a reward for doing well there, it was awarded this title, the Spanish Legion. So if you like, it's a battle honour rather than a description of where it came from. However, having said that, we do find some interesting members. So here's a man called Sempronius Flavinus, and I'm showing you here a line drawing because it's much clearer than the original stone. But you can see he's described as a soldier of the 9th Legion. He's been serving for 7 years. He signed up, therefore, at 23. And then we're told he was a Spaniard. That's the Hispan you can see there in the penultimate line. And interestingly, the I at the top telling us how many years he served, short for Iorum, literally brass, is an interesting thing because normally you wouldn't find that. You'd find a different abbreviation at that point. This was a stone found in Lincoln, but Sempronius originally came from Clunia in the north of Spain. And there's my arrow showing you where Clunia is. And again, my little bit of tourism. This is what you'd see if you went to Clunia today. So again, a magnificent Roman site to see. You can see temple there. You can see a theatre there, top left. The forum area, top right. A big set of public baths, bottom, and one of the examples of these still surviving mosaics. So Sempronius came from really a very, very pleasant place indeed. And we also, interestingly, find evidence of Spaniards serving in the 9th Legion in Spain itself, not just in Britain. So here we've got a very battered inscription. You can see somebody perhaps whose last name was Elisus. And again, if you look carefully, I hope you can see noni, Latin word for 9th, in the 3rd line of this inscription. And then interestingly, that word iorum again for brass. And it's interesting that pops up on the Lincoln inscription. I just wonder actually whether Sempronius has brought a slang term current in Roman Spain into Roman Britain at this point. Those of you who like Roman inscriptions, you can see I've taken this from Hispania Epigraphica, which is an absolutely fantastic site for looking at this sort of material. You can see this again, northern Spain, Palencia is where it comes from, Montequilda. And here's another one from Leon, also very, very fragmentary. You can see the beginning, I think, of Quietus there on the first big line. And there you can see 9 Hisp for the Spanish Legion. So although Hispana isn't marking the legion coming from Spain, certainly it seems that there were Spaniards serving in this legion, and some of them turn up in Roman Britain. But maybe more important than all of that, in terms of the impact at the time, although this man, of course, is hardly remembered at all now, is this gentleman. This is a gold coin struck in London, in fact, and this is the late Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, Magnus the Best, very modest sort of chap. And there, in fact, curiously, the back of the coin, it says the victory of the two emperors, the Eastern and the Western Emperor. There they are sitting together, and a little Nike or victory flying over the top of them. This, in fact, became a very popular coin type in the Dark Ages. Alfred the Great coined with that emblem of the two people standing together with what he thought, of course, was a Christian angel over the top. So who was Magnus Maximus? Well, he was born in Galicia, so modern Galicia. He may have served in a very large revolt against Roman Britain in AD 367, but we certainly know that he was governor in 380, and he was a very successful governor. Scots tried to attack Roman Britain, and Magnus defeats them. He's so popular, he thinks he might as well be emperor. He launches a coup from Britain into the empire as a whole. He easily overruns most of the Western Empire. He sets up, in fact, his capital at Trier. Sadly, perhaps he's the first Christian emperor to execute a Christian on the grounds of theological dispute. And that man, ironically, was also a Spaniard, a chap called Priscillian of Avila. But it doesn't end well, I'm afraid, for Magnus Maximus. He tried to go too far. He invaded Italy, but he was defeated and he was executed. So why is he important? Well, because the Welsh took to him, and in very large numbers. If we look at the kingdoms of medieval Wales, places like Powys and Gwent, their rulers like to trace a long genealogy to show that they are genuine and authentic rulers. The odd thing is that they don't trace their origins back to some native chief. They always trace them back to Magnus Maximus. And you can see how far his reputation went, because even places like Galloway in Scotland, once again, the lineage goes back to this Spaniard, Magnus Maximus. And for those of you who go walking, some of you might know this monument, the Pillar of Eliseg, in the Valley Crucis area in North Wales. The very, very worn inscription there, but once again, a long genealogy on there from the Dark Ages, and it seems to begin with Magnus Maximus. Magnus potentially is very important. The early early British historian Gildas is very, very hostile to him because he says he stripped Britain of enormous numbers of troops to launch his coup on the continent. And Britain was never the same again. Barbarians got in, and getting rid of them was very, very hard. But clearly at the time, and maybe that's because Gildas is hostile, Gildas doesn't like the status quo of his own day, that too is proof of his popularity. And it's still running in the middle of the screen there. You can see the snippet of a book written half in Welsh, half in English, Magnus Maximus and the Birth of Wales, the Nation. So in some respects, although we all remember Hadrian, perhaps Magnus Maximus is a man who had more impact on Britain at the time and perhaps all the way through to the 19th century. Magnus, in particular, pops up in Welsh folklore. So a collection of medieval stories, the Mabinogion, we're not quite sure when they begin. The most famous one is the dream of Maxen Wledig, and Wledig just means ruler or king in Welsh. And here we have Maxen, who is the emperor of Rome, and he dreams of a beautiful woman called Helen who lives in a castle. And he goes in search of her, and he finds her in Saguntium, which is modern Carnarvon. And this story has a happy ending. The legend turns the truth on its head. He fights rebellion at Rome, but he wins, and he lives happily ever after. And it's a strong and powerful myth, so much so that Edward I, when he conquers Wales, plugs into that myth very strongly. And arguably, these fantastic walls at Carnarvon Castle are meant to reference the dream of Maxen Wledig in the Mabinogion. So again, you can see a forgotten hero, but I think a very important hero for centuries in Britain. Now, those are the famous people. Let's have a look at the less famous people. Lots of them, of course, are soldiers, and many of them served in the Roman legions. So I thought I'd put here a Spanish Roman legionary with a couple of people from the Legion back in Spain. One of them you can see sports a splendid moustache, and so curiously does our Roman Spaniard, a man called Caecilius Avitus. And there he is, an optio, is a deputy centurion. And you can see where he comes from. He comes from Emerita Augusta, although this tombstone was found in Chester, in the northwest of Britain, and is on display in the Grosvenor Museum in Chester to this day. Worth remembering, of course, that all of these tombstones would have been brightly painted like this one has been in the Roman period. Caecilius is proudly carrying his badge of rank, which is this long staff that marks him as a deputy centurion. You can also see that he's a literate man, because in his left hand, that's not a bag or a parcel he's carrying, it's actually a pair of writing tablets. And he's not the only one. So these are also tombstones from Chester. And you can see we've got Postumius Solus and Levesius Cararus, and both of them too come from Emerita. One of them, in fact, both of them, looking at this, are just common soldiers, not a deputy centurion. Postumius is doing okay because he's in the top century. If you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down, you can see leg, then 20, then what looks like an arrow pointing to the right. It's a reversed C, which means century, and PP afterwards means top centurion. So this man was serving in the elite part of the 20th Legion. On the other side, Levesius is just an ordinary soldier, though again, if you take away his year's service from his age, you can see he joined up at a very early age indeed. This is where Emerita is. It's modern Merida in Estremadura. I don't know why this map hasn't put a name there, but you'll have to take it from me. The black dot that the arrow is pointing at is Merida, and that's where our 3 soldiers have come from. It was a town founded for retired soldiers after the Cantabrian Wars, and it seems to have kept a military tradition ever afterwards, and continually seems to be sending soldiers all over the Roman Empire. And as a little bit of a comparison, at the top there, top left, the fantastic Roman bridge at Merida, which in fact goes right across that screen. So don't think it stops when a little bit sticks out on the left. All the line, the grey line beyond that, is the bridge going over the Gadiana. I put the rather more feeble medieval bridge over the River Dee underneath it. And then top right, we can see the Amphitheatro at Merida and the smaller amphitheatre at Chester as well. But they're not the only people who turn up in Chester. So we've got this man, Longinius Litus, and he comes from Lucus, as it says there. I've underlined it again for you. And then even more interestingly, Antestus Sabinus, very broken up tombstone, as you can see, but I hope you can just make out where I've underlined in blue, where the battered remnants of the word Cordoba is. Well, Lucus is Lugo in Galicia, and Cordoba, of course, is Cordova in Andalusia. So there we can see again on my red arrows the spread of soldiers who come to Chester in the northwest of England from Spain. So we've got a steady flow of troops, perhaps bringing with them some interesting customs, some interesting dietary tastes, and we'll go on to have a look at those in a few moments. Once again, other people who turn up in Chester, and this time from Clunia, that place we've already seen, provided soldiers elsewhere in Lincoln. So this man, Lucius Praesens, and he's doing a lot better. So he is the second most important centurion in the legion, the princeps. Here's his altar carved on 4 sides, and actually the inscription very worn now, but we can read it. We know firmly that this dates to the middle of the 2nd century AD. In fact, we know it was erected in AD 154. So lots and lots of Spaniards in Chester. But we mustn't forget that the legions are only half the Roman army. there are lots of other units. The auxilia means helpers in Latin, who are smaller, but there are just as many of them as legions. And quite a lot of them too were raised in Spain. So here's a dedication to the top Roman god, Jupiter, the best and greatest. And as you can see by the first cohort, that's a regiment of about 500 people of Spaniards, part mounted, equitata, that's the EQ in line 3, but I've underlined Hisp there for the Spanish origin. So you can see that underlined, I hope, in yellow. The man commanding them actually came from North Africa. I don't think any of these people would have been particularly happy as to where they were posted, because this is found at Maryport, up in Cumberland on the coast of the Irish Sea, and it's pretty cold and it's pretty wet in that part of the world. Here's a man who did a little better for himself, Tanquinus. It's broken, but you can see Tanquinus was a cavalryman, and we suddenly lost the top of his stone, but there he is, you can see riding down his enemy on his tombstone. And we're told that he's again a cavalryman. He comes from the regiment of the Batones, who've been brave at some point in their history because they were all awarded Roman citizenship. He joined up, as you can see, at 20. His tombstone was found in Bath. We don't know why. Usually Roman soldiers weren't stationed in Bath. I think probably Tanquinus had fallen ill and he'd gone down to take the waters in Bath. But we're told he came from a place called Caurium, and he's in the Batones. The Batones are a Spanish tribe. They come from Estremadura, and Caurium, in fact, is the modern town of Coria. So again, for those unfamiliar, that's not on this map, but my red arrow points to it. The green road, by the way, whizzing up all the way, as you can see, to Asturica, which is Astorga, is the so-called Via de la Plata. It's the way the Romans exported silver from Spain. The Asturians are also around. So we've got a unit from Asturia, the Astures. An ala is a cavalry unit, and they were recruited after the wars in Cantabria, Asturia. And mainly people think from near Gijon, which is quite interesting, as we'll see in a moment. They were then taken away from Spain. They were dropped in the Balkans, but they were then moved to Britain, maybe first to a town, a village really, called Ribchester near Preston, and then to Hadrian's Wall. And they ended up here. This is the fort of Chester's on Hadrian's Wall. There's the river North Tyne at the bottom. You can see the fort, and then close to the river is the bathhouse. The interesting thing about the Astures is that although they joined the Roman Empire, they retain their tribal structure. So in amongst the Astures, there are specific clans called gentes. And here's an inscription from Gijon, and we can see a man called Mediganus and his son Rutilius, and we're told they're from the clan ex Genta, I hope you can see on the next to last line there, of the Kilurnigi. And the interesting thing there is that the Roman name for Chester's is Kilurnum. And certainly some scholars have suggested that this group of Asturians, recruited from this tribal subgroup, if you like, of the Astures, gave their name to the fort on Hadrian's Wall. There is a bit of an argument about that, because a lot of our inscriptions, like the one I put on here, of an aqueduct being brought to their fort, come from a little bit later. So Ulpius Marcellus is around in the 180s, some 50, 60 years after Hadrian's Wall was built. People say that's too late for the name of the fort to have popped up. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting theory. Maybe this group of Asturians, in fact, gave the name of a place to part of Roman Britain. And if we come closer home to Manchester, I put Iberia in Britannia at the beginning, because I put a couple of Portuguese things in. And actually, around Manchester, it looks like there was a little regiment, 500 people, from Portugal stationed in Manchester. And then at this little fort at Castleshaw, out Oldham Way, not quite big enough to be a full fort itself. I think people would come out from Manchester to man it. There's a picture of what it might have looked like. And this is the third regiment from Braca Augusta. And Braca Augusta is Braga in the north of Portugal. Sadly, we've no inscriptions. What we do have, though, are a lot of roof tiles stamped with the regimental badge. And I think you can see C for cohort there, and then 3 with a line over saying, I'm a number, I am number 3, and then BR for Braca Augustanorum afterwards. So even Manchester gets a bit of Iberia. And the Basques are in not just in Roman Britain, but beyond Roman Britain. So this is a dedication to the standards, which were semi-religious in the Roman period, of a group of people called the Varduli. And the Varduli were a tribe we know come from the Basque country. This is from High Rochester. High Rochester would have been a really frightening posting in the Roman world, because this is a fort outside of the province, beyond Hadrian's Wall, stuck amid a lot of barbarians. So quite a scary place beyond the edge of empire. Quite a lot of things from there. On the left, you can see a carving from High Rochester. There's a rather sulky-looking Venus bathing. Whether that was carved by the Varduli is an interesting question, but I put a nicer picture of by Romero de Torres from Cordoba, showing that Spanish. If that is Spanish art on the left, it's come on in droves since then. And perhaps the most interesting of all of these inscriptions as we move away from soldiers is this one. So this again comes from beyond the empire. Birens is a fort the other side of Hadrian's Wall in Dumfriesshire, so in Scotland. Again, a scary posting. And what we've got is the tombstone of a man called Afutianus. And Afutianus came from a regiment raised in Tungria, which is more or less the Belgian-French border, that part of the world. But the name of his wife is striking, Flavia Baetica, because Baetica is the province which is now modern Andalusia. The lady's name suggests very strongly to me that she'd been a slave of the province. The Roman government owned their own slaves, and she'd been freed. How then this lady from Andalusia met a man from Belgium, and how they both ended up in Scotland, for me is one of those intriguing mysteries of Roman Britain. We will never know, I think, how that story fills out, but I think it's an absolutely fascinating story, and quite how this lady got from where she started life in the south of Spain to the south of Scotland really is something which tantalizes me. Now, we also mentioned tapas, and let's start with olives, something we often get, of course, you're served in bars in Spain. And we find that olives from Spain are imported to Britain. So my numbers at the top are different sorts of amphorae, these long, usually thin, although we see not always thin, ceramic vessels that are basically the barrels of the Roman world. And my little stars there show you where Spanish barrels or amphorae of olives have been found. The most spectacular one, just off the sea in Kent, so it's where it says L555, that's London amphorae style 555. It's the spot bottom right there in Kent. But there's a shipwreck, a place called the Pan Sands, and a notoriously dangerous area for shipping just off Kent. And a sealed amphora was found there. And the sealed amphora had no fewer than 6,206 olives preserved in what would have been, in its day, a grape syrup dating from the 70s AD. So that's the sorts of things which are being imported to Roman Britain, and they're coming from Spain. There's a photograph of the 6,206 olives being poured out of this perfectly preserved amphora from the shipwreck. Now, with olives, of course, come olive oil. And olive oil was the great industry of southern Spain in the Roman period. Andalusia was a very rich part of the Roman Empire. Its richness rested on olive oil. Exported in these big, fat amphorae. This is something called a Dressel 20 amphora. It would stand a good 3 feet high, so I mean they're not small things by any means. And they comprise an enormous quantity of all the amphora found in Britain. So 75% of all the amphora in Britain are from Spain, and probably about 90% of that 75% are Dressel 20 amphorae. And again, you can see they get around. They're not just military, they're not just civilian, they go across the province. And it makes you wonder whether some of these Spanish soldiers who came over were bringing these tastes with them. It's very difficult to know. One of the things we sadly don't know is the names of the merchants who shipped this material. They could have been Spaniards, or of course, this stuff could have been sold on and sold on and sold on and passed through many hands before it finally arrived here in Britain. But certainly the origin of this material is most definitely Spanish. And then, of course, notoriously, the Romans loved rotten fish sauce. Garum is a generic term for that. Other words are used in Latin as well, like liquamen and moria. It's manufactured all around the Mediterranean coast, and in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, it pops all the way round to Lisbon, in fact, and it's imported to Britain. There probably are due to be a few extra dots on that map. Certainly the top one, which is at Carlisle, we know for a fact that this material was consumed at Vindolanda. The famous Vindolanda tablets mention Moria, and somebody is ordering a pint and a half of it. One would hope they didn't pour the whole pint and a half over a single helping or something. It's also now being remade in Spain. So a collaboration mainly speared by, I think, the Universidades de Cádiz and Huelva. People are trying to rediscover the recipe. Here's a little glass amphora, a flor de garum is what they call it, and you can now buy this material if you want to. In the background at the top, we see Bailo Claudia down by Tarifa on the south coast of Spain, which is one of the areas where this material was manufactured. And again, if we look there at the top, we can see Bailo Claudia. Underneath, we see Troia, which is near Setúbal in Portugal. And in both cases, I think you can see these big vats. And what you would do is you put a layer of salt, a layer of fish, a layer of salt, a layer of fish, till you fill it right to the top. And some of these things are 2 or 3 meters deep. And then you just let the sun shine. And as it all rotted down, you'd scoop off the material, put it in the amphoras, and sell it at a profit. Wine also comes to Roman Britain from Roman Spain, and indeed along the south coast, there seems to have been a taste for Catalan wine. There are amphorae which specifically come from Catalonia, and they are known to be wine type amphorae. But perhaps as interesting as all of that, we can see that in Tintagel, famously, of course, associated with King Arthur, at the very, very end of the classical period, in fact, beyond the end of the classical period, a smashed glass flagon has been found, and it looks pretty clear that this flagon came from Spain. It has very, very close similarities with glassware we know was being made around Cádiz and Malaga in that part of the time, time. Spanish wine seems to have been well thought of in Roman Britain. Indeed, even if you go back to the pre-Roman period, the Celts of the pre-Roman period were already importing wine from Spain at that time. So it's quite possible that King Arthur did indeed drink Spanish wine. An interesting curiosity. But King Arthur, of course, brings us towards the end of the Roman period. And there's just one other interesting link, which perhaps brings us back to Tacitus and the Silures and the Newport ship. And that's this, that in Spain, in the 6th century, we know at the top of Galicia, there is a bishopric called Britannia. and indeed there's still a small town called Bretonia to this day. Why is it called that? Well, the most plausible reason is, just as we know quite a lot of Britons fled the invasion of the Saxons from Britain, and they went to Brittany, hence its name, in France, a smaller number seem to have fled to the north of Spain, establishing a small community there. Of course, everyone was Christian by that time, and we know that at the Second Council of Braga, I'm very interested in this period from Iberian history, and we have an awful lot of church history. So we've got the documents and the decisions from the Second Council of Braga. We have a bishop called Mylock, and Mylock is very good British Celtic. And he appears, he's described as the bishop of the Britannorum, and that could just be Britonia, but probably it's Britonia because it's a refugee community. And we have this little bishopric of Britons, which lasts down into at least the 8th century. And there in Santa Maria de Bretonia, in the main plaza, we can see a modern statue of Bishop Mylock, a reminder that although Britain received a lot of things from Spain in this classical period, perhaps in the end, Spain received this little Christian community of Celts from Britain. And at that point, I'm going to draw to a close. I'm more than happy if people want to show me why I'm wrong. They've probably got some really good reasons why I'm wrong. And I can only apologize for the timeout beforehand. I'm not quite sure what happened
there. Thank you, Andrew. It was fascinating. So much to be learned about the relations between the Iberian Peninsula and Britain. And as we mentioned, you are all welcome. If you have any questions to put to our guest. I have just a comment, and I don't know if there's a basis for that or not. You might tell us, but when you look at the Celtic culture that is very present in Wales, in Scotland, also Ireland, and also in Galicia, in northern Spain, the history shows us, and what you have explained also, this exchange between Galicia and Britain, this familiarity, maybe because of also the landscape, and many things are very similar in Galicia and in Britain. Is there a link between those factors, or not really? It's just a coincidence.
It's hard to know, isn't it? Certainly, I think people can establish that in prehistory there was some sort of contact between Spain and certainly parts of Ireland. I think the evidence for contact with Britain is less secure, but I think it would also be foolish to think that if people are not sailing across the Bay of Biscay to Ireland, they're probably going to end up in Cornwall and parts of the south of Wales as well. So whether Tacitus is right that whole peoples came and settled is, I think, an interesting question. We can't really resolve it, but I would be very, very surprised if there was no contact at all between the island of Britain and that northwestern part of Spain.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions from the audience. In that case, I just have to thank you again for this wonderful lecture that you have given to us. There are still so much to learn about the relations. I have personally that before we started this talk, I am very passionate about the Roman heritage, not only in Spain or Britain, but in the whole Europe. And we have received from the Romans so many things. But again, tonight it has been illustrated this very special link between Britain and the Iberian Peninsula that I didn't really know in most of the aspects that you explained. So it was very informative, very rich. Thank you very much, Dr. Fia, again. and it was a real honor and pleasure to have you tonight. Muchísimas gracias.
But I just say thank you in turn, and also urge people who are interested in the Romans to visit the sites in Spain. Sadly, many people, I think, in Britain don't realize the richness of Spain's Roman heritage. So places like Merida, Clunia, but also, of course, Ampurias in Catalonia, Barcelona and Tarragona have excellent remains to see. Cartagena has splendid remains too, and they've been worked on a lot in recent years. There really is a wonderful richness of heritage there. And it is a shame, in my opinion, that people in Britain are not as aware of it as they might be.
Yeah, that is also part of our job, yeah, to inform and to show the richness of Spanish, the Roman heritage in Spain, but especially also the links between our both countries, which is a richness for the British and for the Spanish. So muchísimas gracias y ha sido un placer. Espero contar con usted en el futuro, porque bueno, mencionó algunos sitios, Ampuria, en la Costa Brava, Cartagena. Hay muchísimos sitios que podemos explorar juntos, así que ya aprovecho la oportunidad para invitarle a una futura conferencia sobre uno de estos lugares en España. Muchísimas gracias, doctor Fía.
No, gracias.